at least 15 of them while they have been in detention. So I'm going to hand over to Jane now. Big hand for Jane, please.
Hi, so my name is Jane Kevin and I'm a retired GP from the North West of England, most lately working in Liverpool. There is no justification for the abduction and detention of innocent civilians. Whoever they are, in whatever circumstances, it's never right. It's never excusable. It should never be overlooked. People should not be abducted as part of a military strategy, as a way of reducing fear in the population. It's a hideous crime. It's prohibited under international humanitarian law. The condemnation of such an act must be without bias and irrespective of the perpetrator. So there is no justification when Hamas abducted 251 people from Israel and took them into Gaza and kept them in detention. Their whereabouts and welfare unknown. People terrified, their families terrified and grieving. No access to family, no access to lawyers, robbed of their rights to freedom, no access to the likes of the Red Cross to assess their welfare. The 251 Israelis abducted and forcibly detained are referred to as hostages. The international community rightly raised its voice in condemnation. There was an international outcry, as there should have been. The case of these hostages was widely covered by mainstream media. 37 of them are now dead, 117 are now free, 100 remain detained. Their whereabouts unknown, their welfare unknown. It's not clear to me what diplomacy is ongoing currently to bring about their release. Their release should be unconditional. People should not be used as bargaining chips. And there is no justification for the abduction and forced detention of innocent Palestinian civilians by the Israeli army. Abducted without charge, their whereabouts and welfare unknown. People terrified, families terrified and grieving. No access to family, no access to lawyers, robbed of their rights to freedom. No access granted to the likes of the Red Cross to assess their welfare. When innocent Palestinian civilians are abducted and detained by the Israeli army, they are called prisoners and detainees. They are not referred to as hostages. The international community does not raise its voice in condemnation. There is a lack of outcry. There is a lack of mainstream media coverage. The majority of the general population is barely aware of their existence. The failure to condemn such an act is evidence of bias. It is evident that condemnation depends on the perpetrator. Another example of Israel's impunity. Israel's powerful propaganda, unverified claims that all those abducted are Hamas operatives, is a claim so generally made it's mockable. B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organisation, in July 2024 published a document recording Israeli prison statistics of 3,340 Palestinians detained without charge. Those are Israeli prison statistics. The Israeli Prison Services publishes those figures every 3 months without shame that it has thousands of Palestinians detained without charge. I don't know what, if any, diplomacy is underway internationally to secure their freedom, which should be unconditional. Amongst those 3,000 plus barely mentioned people are hundreds of healthcare staff, around 400 abducted from their places of work. There are eyewitness accounts and there is video evidence of humiliation at the time of abduction, being forced to strip to their underwear, some having their hands zip-lock tied, some blindfolded. There are testimonies and there is eyewitness evidence of mistreatment and torture in Israeli custody, sexual violence and attacks by dogs. There is never any justification for torture. No perpetrator of torture should ever be excused or overlooked. It is one of the darkest acts that one commits against another. An act of power, an act of control. But yet again, Israel acts with sickening impunity. What control does Zionism have over the mainstream media that this is not at the forefront of mainstream news? What power does the Israeli propaganda machine have that allows the majority of the UK population and the UK Parliament to turn a blind eye to this? We know the names of 5 healthcare staff who have been killed in the custody of in the custody of the Israeli prison service and in detention centres. More may have been killed. It took several months for these deaths to be reported to their families. Their bodies have not been released. What is there to hide? The man who has become the face of abducted healthcare staff is Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, paediatrician and director of the Kamal Adwan Hospital in North Gaza. You've probably seen the photo of him in his white coat walking towards soldiers in a tank outside the hospital. Such courage, such defiance, such an inspiration. He had become the voice of Gaza's decimated healthcare system, refusing to evacuate from the hospital when ordered to do so by the army, together with other medical staff refusing to leave his patients. After the almost total blockade of northern Gaza last October, Dr. Abu Safia consistently pleaded for the protection of the Kamal Adwan Hospital and for the intervention of the international community. Those appeals were ignored, those appeals went unanswered. After over 80 days of asking for help, on December the 27th, the Israeli forces launched a major operation against the Kamal Adwan Hospital, rendering it unusable. Dr. Abu Safia and several members of the medical staff were abducted. He was severely beaten, forced to strip. He is now at the sedate Teeman detention centre, notorious for the use of torture. He would have known that this was likely to be his fate if he failed to comply with the orders to evacuate. He would have known of the killing in custody of Dr. Adnan Al-Bursh, one of Gaza's most prominent doctors based at Al-Shifa Hospital. Knowing the risk, he continued in his role as carer and advocate of his patients. There is a growing grassroots campaign crying out for his release, and for the release of other Palestinians detained without charge. Hostages, the abduction of healthcare staff as well as their targeted killing is part of Israel's plan to crush the Gaza health system, taking away the caregivers. The Gaza health system is essentially successfully crushed. In the isolated north of Gaza, there is no hospital to offer care. Hospitals shut down, forced to evacuate. Can you imagine the carnage, the suffering, the desperation? Despite the illegal abductions, despite the torture, despite the deaths in custody, despite its leader being wanted by the International Criminal Court, the UK government still affords Israel its military, political and moral support. Our advocacy and campaigning must and will continue.